Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ren Yan, Assistant Professor of Modern Chinese Popular Culture at UBC. Welcome to join us tonight to celebrate Professor Feixian Wang's new book, Pirates and Publishers, A Social History of Copyright in Modern China. But first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. This land where our virtual event is taking place has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam, who for millennia have passed on their culture, history, and traditions from one generation to the next on the site. We are very grateful for the opportunity to work and live here. So this book talk is hosted by UBC's Center for Chinese Research, and I just want to extend a welcome to our guest speaker, Professor Wang, and our discussants and audience from near and far. Okay. So I also want to thank our event coordinators, Lisa Ren and Matthew Putman, for their logistic support and diligent work. Now, let me give you a brief introduction of our speakers today. Professor Feixian Wang is a historian of modern China with a particular interest in how information, ideas, and practices were produced, transmitted, and consumed across different societies in East Asia. And her new book, Pirates and Publishers, A Social History of Copyright in Modern China, explores how Chinese authors, translators, publishers, and booksellers received, appropriated, practiced, and contested the very concept of copyright from the 1890s to the 1950s. And she will be joined by Hao Yue Li and Jiaqi Yao today. Hao Yue is a PhD student in Asian Studies at UBC. Her dissertation explores the intertwined relationship between literary writing and material culture in late imperial China, with a focus on the older motifs, knowledge, and artifacts of sense and connoisseurship. This study hopes to unravel how the knowledge of sense is circulated, appropriated in late imperial China. And Jiaqi is a PhD candidate in Asian Studies at UBC. She's now working on her dissertation, Mapping Boundaries, Literary Self, Mobility, and Displacement in Wartime China, 1931 to 1949, which examines how Chinese writers and artists reconfigure everyday life, nationalist sentiments, and aesthetic practices in their exile and travel during the chaotic wartime conditions. And her project aims to bring a new perspective on how literature and culture are connected in motion and the relationship between leisure and crisis. So we will first invite Dr. Wang to introduce her book, and then Hao Yue and Jiaqi will deliver their respective responses. In the meanwhile, if you have anything you want to say or comment on, or any questions you want to ask, please put it in the Q&A box, either in Chinese or English, and I will be happy to convey that to Dr. Wang, and she can address them one by one in the following Q&A session. Alternatively, you can also raise your hand during the Q&A, and then we will be able to unmute you so that you can speak directly to Professor Wang. If you encountered any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat as well. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Wang. And Professor Wang, the screen is yours.
Okay, so thank you, Ren, for your invitation and introduction. It's a great pleasure to discuss my book with colleagues and friends at UBC's Chinese Studies communities and beyond. And so let me share my screen. Okay. So, today I only have like 10 minutes to discuss my book, so I'm not going to cover everything. And so when we think about copyright or intellectual property right in China, this might be what comes to our mind. Oops. Wait. Yeah, like copycat, 山寨, cell phone, pirate software, knockoff handbags, fake luxurious products, a fake Harry Potter novel, etc., etc. As if China is a piracy heaven, a land with little or no copyright protection. So it has been conventionally believed and argued by policymakers, journalists, scholars, especially those outside of China, that the Chinese pirate because they have yet to develop a sense of copyright. That it seems to be nature to consider or assume that the history of copyright in China would be a story of failure. But are these two conventional wisdom true? In its pioneer study To Steal a Book is an Elegant Offense, William Arthur tries to explain the reasons why IPR law failed in China. He argues that the culture, tradition, and political culture in China, which favored tradition and government control over innovation and creativities, community interests over individual property right, made it impossible for China to develop homegrown IPR doctrine. And attempts to transplant modern or Western copyright law since the second half of the 19th century were done under tremendous foreign pressure with little or no local incentive and support. So as a result, such transplantation were far from successful. And if we examine the fate of various copyright laws issued by Chinese state in early 20th century, we may reach the conclusion that the law was either very unlucky or cursed. A few months after the copyright law of the Great Qing was put in effect, the Qing Empire was overthrown by the revolutionaries. In 1915, soon after the Beiyang government passed its copyright law, then President Yuan Shikai declared himself the Emperor of Chinese Empire. In 1928, after Chiang Kai-shek nominally unified the country, the nationalist government issued its own copyright law. But again, whether this law has been seriously enforced remains a question, as the nationalist government was facing both the threat from the communism and aggression from Japan. So what we see is that in the midst of political uncertainty, copyright protection, understandably, might not be the top priority for Chinese state that with compromised power and limited resources. But what if the state's law wasn't the only means for protection? Then maybe we miss a considerable proportion of what was going on if we solely focus on the state's lawmaking and formal court system. So in my books, I propose a different approach to explore the history of copyright in modern China. I shift my focus from the maker of the law, the state, to the user of the law, especially publishers, booksellers, and authors, who cares about the issue of copyright law or copyright more than the rest of the society. Instead of asking how was copyright law made, I ask how was the concept of copyright understood and practiced? So in my books, I trace how the term for copyright in Chinese, 版权, which literally means right to printing blocks, how this term has been used, understood, and practiced from the 1890s, when the term first became popular, to the 1950s, when it gradually faded out from China's public discussion. And this approach allowed us to broaden the scope of our research. And then we see a different picture, a more dynamic and complicated story of copyright in China emerged. So we see copyright, the term copyright, in various places, in advertisements, in public announcements, in reproduction of individual officials' orders. We see them in the copyright contracts signed between publishers and authors, and then develop a very elaborate system to calculate and deliver loyalty. And we see them in the Ministry of Education's newsletter. We see them in the guilds, the booksellers guilds registration and copyright dispute mediation records. We can even find them in the actual copies of pirate books, or the copyright seals designed by renowned culture figures, such as this one you see, which was created by the famous translator Yan Fu. So in this new different picture, or this what I call the social history of copyright in China, we see that in fact Chinese authors, publishers, civic organizations, they actively utilize the concept of copyright or 版权 in their everyday life since the turn of the 20th century. They use it to claim ownership of their books, seek official recognition and protection, lobby for more legal protection, create their own 版权 registration system and self-regulation mechanism. They use it to settle copyright disputes, punish pirates, and even established their own anti-piracy pirate police force. So this is far from a story of unsuccessful legal transplantation. My book shows how copyright as an alien doctrine was practiced and appropriated in China's local context. Especially, we see how imperial woodblock printing, book trade traditions, literati culture values, and trade guilds self-regulation mechanism profoundly shaped Chinese understanding and practice of 版权. It also illustrates how China's culture figures as economic actors use the concept of copyright to organize and manage their economic life, define authorship and the value of their works during a period of rapid transitions in knowledge order, technology, and politics. At the same time, it tries to contribute to the discussion of state, society, and market dynamic in modern China by reconstructing the booksellers' and authors' challenges and strategy when navigating between the state's weak formal legal system and the bookseller's robust customary legal regime. It shows how, in fact, the state, author, and publishers constantly and creatively use and manipulate each other to advance their own interests. So, a final word. In terms of the title of the book, one thing that I emphasize in this book is this ambiguity between Chinese pirates and publishers I studied. They could be victims of piracy in one case, but villains who pirate other people's books in other occasions. So having a sense of copyright and violating other people's copyright may not be mutually exclusive. Taking commercial press as an example, this leading publishing house in China, they were the leading domestic advocate for copyright law. This guy you see here, Xia Ruifang, he was the leader of Shanghai Booksellers Guild. And they were also the first press that established and sustained a loyalty system with its authors. And that system later would be widely adopted by their peers. Yet for many British and American publishers at the time, this guy, Xia Ruifang, the general manager of commercial press, was nothing but a pirate king of China, as the commercial press aggressively pirate their works without authorization. And so this is why this book is called Pirates and Publishers. I want to highlight this dual faces of the peoples I study. And so the final, so I hope this this short presentation help you understand where this book is coming from and what I attempt to do in this book. And so finally, the paperback version is going to be released soon this summer, and so please buy it and don't pirate it. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Professor Wang, for this wonderful introduction. So now I think I'm going to turn to Jiaqi for the first response. Jiaqi, please.
Yeah, because how the other panelists have issues to connect to this Zoom conference from China, so I may go first. And my comments and my questions is actually about the later part of your book. Yeah, and also, now I'm in CCR office, so we would like to, it would be our honor if in the future, Professor Wang, you could have chance to really visit UBC campus in person and visit our office later, if possible. Okay, so before I start my comments and review, there's a little bit disclaimer because I'm not studying legal history and copyright, so I don't think I'm really qualified to comment on Professor Wang's contribution to the field of legal history. But I believe it is an eye-opening monograph for many people, whether these people are scholars or ordinary readers, to get to know more about the practice of protecting copyright in China. And I really appreciate Dr. Wang's approach to scrutinizing the aspect of copyright as an extra law practice rather than taking it simply as a kind of Western legal concept transplanted in modern China, and we know that it's not the case. My review, which is mainly concerned with, I said the later 4 chapters, is based on my own study thoughts and my study area of modern Chinese literature and culture. So my comments and questions may go beyond the scope of like copyright and legal history and focusing more on the aspects of social and cultural history and of course literature. So in chapter 5 and chapter 6, these 2 chapters are about the Republican period. So one discovery that really interests me in the book is that the copyright protection in the Republican era is very publisher-centered rather than author-centered. And these 2 chapters tell a very compelling and illuminating history of the organization, the SBG, the Shanghai Booksellers Guild, which is an organization protecting and coordinating about these benefits of the publishers. So I feel like the concept of shudi, this very tangible object, is very interesting. Like the guild help the publishers to register these objects and to protect, to practice the protection of copyright based on that. So in my understanding that shudi can only be produced by the publishing houses, by machines, not by author or kind of individuals. So it somehow reflects a kind of capitalist hierarchy during the Republican era. And I'm also amazed by the case of Li Difan versus Xia Ruifeng, the manager of the commercial press, and the stories of the investigators and detectives in Shanghai and Beijing. So in these stories, I found a very fascinating word connections, as you mentioned in on page 193. I think it's one of the perfect words to describe the operation of this organization and the bylaw system, which is parallel to that weak state legal codes. It's quite astonishing for me how the investigators, the press managers, and the guild use connections to solve puzzles and cases. So it just reminds me that in Chinese literature, there's a very interesting word called jianghu, or river and lake, which is kind of a slippery social and cultural concept describing the commoners and vagabonds, some anarchic society opposing to the official world, the imperial court. So one important characteristic of jianghu is exactly the human connections and how you can solve problems without go to the government, the yamen or the court, which these are manifested in this small society of Chaseboard Street and also in the Beiping publishing market, the society. And which showed that actually connections and bylaws are were more effective than legal force. Thus, I really found this very interesting and kind of has this close connection to my field, is like how to take SBG and the whole kind of publishing community as a modern literary and cultural entrepreneurs version of jianghu. And for the socialist period, Professor Wang Yu analyzes the communist policy over the years, and even before the communists came into power. It's very interesting to see that when they were not in the government, they are not controlling the nation. They actually use this a kind of quote unquote guerrilla reprinting operation, as you mentioned, in the CCP controlled areas. So it's a kind of like pirate behavior. So people smuggle the stereotype into the nationalist controlled area for spreading. So you indicate in the book that, quote, reprinting was also one way to resist against the capitalist system and the nationalist government's authority, end quote. So it's very interesting to see this part, and then later moving to the socialist period, the change of the attitude of the Communist Party after 1949. So the Central Propaganda Department called to stop reprinting unauthorized materials, mainly by the private publishers. But they themselves actually did it a lot in the earlier decade. So it is fascinating to see first how the communist government transforms this printing industry and the capitalist book market to, for me, I think it's a socialist collective service by authorizing the pirate publisher or the private publishers the right to reprint, and actually the government provide better stereotypes for them. And second, it's also interesting to see how the communist government continued their strategy in the Yan period to kind of tame the intellectuals and writers, which also affected perceptions of copyright in the socialist period. Yeah, so these are the thing I found it's very interesting, and they are really closely related to my own studies. And I would like to ask 3 questions based on my reflections. So first, we talked about the trajectory of how the Communist Party dealt with the issue of copyright during the Sino-Japanese War period, and when they were actually one of the pirates of the age. So overall, this book devoted much space to the late imperial and early Republican era, and also a part about the socialist period. So I was wondering about the situation in wartime, during wartime. And I understand it's very challenging, and the time period is very chaotic, not only for the printing industry, but also for the nation overall. So there's a lot of things happening during the time. Many writers moved to the hinterland, but there's still this active Shanghai publishing market there. So would you please talk a little bit about your findings of the copyright development or impediment during this period? And what kind of challenges did you encounter, for example, when you're looking for the archival materials, or when you think about kind of narratives about that period, if there are any? And the second question is about the issues of unauthorized copies and printings as an important way of resistance. In my studies in the field of literature, we know that there were writers, for example, especially left-wing writers like Xiao Hong, Xiao Jun. They use this author because their books cannot be really allowed by the nationalist government. So they publish their works under pseudonyms by themselves, and there's no kind of authorization by the government. And then we see that both the nationalist regime and the communist government took copyright approval and protection actually as a channel to filter, control, and censor the publishing industry, censor the distribution of knowledge and ideologies. So what is your opinion on this interesting phenomenon, considering copyright in modern China is closely linked with issues of political authorization and censorship and then resistance? It is intriguing to me that the absence of legal stipulation and the weak enforcement of legal codes actually make the literary revolution possible. And my third question is about gender. I guess you have received many questions about the aspect of gender in the topic of Chinese copyright. While the SBG and the most of the publishing houses were, of course, led by males for sure, I was wondering what is the position of the female in the struggle and practice of copyright. You have mentioned Ding Ling in the later chapter, so it also reminds me of Zhang Ailing, who should be very opinionated about royalties and personal rights. So also I would like to ask, did you find the gender dynamics change in the realm of copyright and book industry after 1949, or in the contemporary era? Yes, that's my comments and questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Jiaqi. I think Professor Wang, I'm gonna let you take a breath. So as Jiaqi mentioned, Hao Yue is currently in China, and she had difficulty of logging on her VPN and joining us on the site. So she sent me her well-prepared script with commentary and 3 questions. So I think in a way I'm authorized by her to summarize and paraphrase and read her commentary as a replacement of her virtual presence. Okay, so Hao Yue, I'm thinking about you, and I hope my paraphrase will do justice to your keen comments here. Okay, so so here I go. So Hao Yue mentioned 2 things that in the book that really impressed her, and I think both have to do with Professor Wang's meticulous attention to the historical context of the emergence of Chinese copyright law. And instead of to champion this global discourse of copyright, which oftentimes is Euro-American centered, this monograph contributes to the field of copyright studies with China, right, as an example of non-Western society with its own traditions of copyright ideas or consciousness. So I think Hao Yue mentioned in particular that the Ming-Qing printing culture dates to the Cangban seal tradition. And the book also tries to show that in the late imperial and early republican eras, how the Cangban seal tradition converge with the new ethos of new learning and Western knowledge, right, making the Chinese notion of copyright really a hybrid concept. So now I come to the three questions Hao Yue wants to raise. And the first question is about the difference between Yanfu and Ling Shu, both of which are discussed by Professor Wang in the first half of the book. So Hao Yue's question, if I understand correctly, is about the relationship between the popularity or popularization of copyright discourse and the changing notion of authorship. Because Ling Shu, in a way, and I also read that part, Ling Shu, in a way, harks back to the traditional literati identity as an author who, to some extent, gives away this ownership of the book to the publisher, right, who owns all the printing blocks. Right? This is the notion of a ban. And but Yanfu, I think, in Professor Wang's discussion, really wants to honor her own mental label, right, which is less tangible than the printing blocks. So I think based on this transformation, can we think about the larger question about authorship in that context? Hao Yue's second question is about the role played by technology in the making and unmaking of copyright and piracy. Right? As Professor Wang mentioned in her introduction, there are waves of scholars who claim that the precondition of copyright is the development of printing technology. Right? So, and China has been regarded as one of the first inventors of printing technology, for sure. And there are a lot of technological terms Professor Wang mentioned in her book, ranging from lithograph, mechanical letterpress, lithograph, printing blocks, and stereotype, and so on. And thinking about what we are experiencing today with the rise of digital technology, there are way more materials and commodities to be copyrighted. So Hao Yue wants to ask you to comment on the effect of technological innovation on the concept and practice of copyright and piracy, based on some of the discussions we already read in the book. And the final question is about, I think, the changing connotations of the concept of reprinting. Because reprinting as a neutral concept harks all the way back to Imperial China. And as Professor Wang mentioned in one of her footnotes on page 17, Liang Qichao, who used to have a habit of appropriating his Japanese contemporary works as his own, which was considered not that problematic, right? But which definitely violates the modern IPR standards. So I think then with the introduction of the notion of piracy, everything gets more stigmatized and moralized, always as something undesirable, something unspeakable, something, even you did it, you have to make an excuse to cover it up. So I think that part of the moralizing discourse is very much there. And then when we come to the communist practice, from the Yan'an days to their later, the high socialism, reprinting once again becomes something justifiable, because they would think piracy and copyright is irrelevant to the socialist regime of free reprinting, or in Professor Wang's words, I remember the guerrilla, right, of a style of reprinting. So I think I think this Professor Wang's book really shows the historical development or changing associations with the notion of reprinting in the first half of 20th century. So I think that is all Hao Yue wants to say, and I think I'm gonna stop here. And so Professor Wang, feel free to pick on any questions you want to elaborate. Yeah.
Okay, so this thank you, Jia and Hao Yue, for your thorough and insightful comments and questions. And so, okay, they are all very difficult questions, and so I try to make my response brief. In terms of Jiaqi's comments on capitalist hierarchy, and I think yes, there is definitely something there, and I'm glad that you noticed that, because one of the things that Shanghai publishers and authors was struggling to determine at the time was like the same problems, the same issue also troubles publishers elsewhere. Is like, what was the essential, the core means of production that make the production of books possible? So it's the mechanical, like it's the shudi, the master copy, the letter press, and the capital investment, and the possession of machinery that come like with it. The key reason why a book's become a book, or it was the author's labor, the author's creation, that make a book possible. And so I think there is this interesting tension there. And but as you can see, like it was in modern China's case, it was those who possess capital and machinery get to set the rule instead of the sort of like artisanal work, like mental labor, the author who got the say. And that's also why later on, after 1949, like the CCP, one of the CCPs, at the core of CCP's copyright policy or anti-copyright piracy, is that they want to acknowledge the labor that authors put in. And so like by removing the capitalists, they thought this is a way to liberate them from this endless exploitation. And I also like your comments on how actually what I present in the book is the modern version of Jianghu and the Literati circle. And I think that's a very nice way to put it. And as for my three questions that you raised, yes, I did not spend too much time discussing wartime, partly because when I wrote the dissertation, that dissertation ended in 1937. And but later on, when I revised this work into a book, I was told repeatedly that I need to add a chapter about post-1949. And so that's why there is this gap. But there is also intellectual reason why I did not mention wartime period, because I think that's a period that deserves to be treated independently, because the situation during the wartime is very different. So in this case, I would I would highly recommend a book, China's War Against Smuggling, like by Philip Tai. Like in there, like he has a wonderful chapter to illustrate the dilemma and the complexity of wartime China in terms of any kinds of legal enforcement. And also we see that the national market was fragmented, or gradually fragmented, but somehow still interconnected during the wartime. But we have to also recognize, as you mentioned, that yes, like some people flee to Yan'an, some presses flee to Chongqing, and some stay in Shanghai. But we also, this before 1937, this was one big intellectual and cultural community. And to a certain extent, during the wartime, they were still interconnected. But because of the war, the transportation was very difficult. And the law enforcement was also very scattered. And what's even more tricky, what's even trickier is that at the time, there were actually multiple legal regions in China, right? You have Manchukuo, and you have the Wang Jingwei government control the occupied area. You have the nationalist government control the home front. Even within the home front, the regulation in Chongqing and the regulation in Guilin are also different. And so we're here we see books got Shanghai books got reprinted in Manchukuo and then smuggling back to Beiping. In the past, that's just like provincial pirates, but during the wartime, this is like cross-national border. These are like different, these are international issues. And so that's why I think this is a topic that deserves to be studied further. And I did not have the space in my book to really elaborate on that. And in terms of the interesting question, the connection between copyright and censorship, or copyright and information control, I think you are right. And also this is a very interesting phenomena, as I discussed in the conclusion. Yes, all this, the late Qing, the Beiyang government and the nationalist government, and to a certain extent the early PRC, they may not have the extreme or the ideal capacity in terms of enforcing its law and establishing its authority. They may be considered as weak state, but they also inherited the unparallelable symbolic authority as a state from the imperial period. So they themselves consider themselves as the government, as the intellectual authority. And the society, to a certain extent, also look up on them and expect them to behave like some sort of intellectual and cultural authority. So that's why the connection between that's why information control or censorship via the channel of copyright was considered okay, and even in some cases welcomed. And I think this is, to a certain extent, a more again you see this long continuity from late imperial to the Republican to PRC period. And as for gender, yes, this is a problem, and I'm fully aware of that. And I did try to find records about female authors and or female publishers in participating and engaging in this in this copyright matters. But unfortunately, I didn't find too much. And even for Zhang Ailing, I think there are very little about her. Maybe after the later after post-war period, there may be more. And but from for the period I studied, there are very little female actors that I can identify and discuss. And that also shows as a matter of fact, this was a predominantly a male a male dominate arena, the publishing industry and etc. And as for Hao Yue's question, they are all very good questions. And so the differences between Yan Fu and Lin Shu, I think they represent two different ideas. Going back to the means of production question, they have a different idea and different understanding of what it meant to be an author or a translator, and the relationship between author and the manuscript. or the work they created. Like, so for in Yan Fu's case, he was probably in his generation the one that has the idea that's most close to what we consider as like modern authorship now. So for him, he believed that his ownership of the work he translated extend to every single copy of the book that got produced. So that's why he asked for loyalty. And that's why he also believes that he can sell the same thing three times or multiple times. However, for Lin Shu, I think he and some of the other people, like he was not the only one, operate in a more traditional mode. He considered like manuscript, the manuscript itself, it's one single item, an entity that can only be sold once. So his relationship with commercial press is very simple. He published it, he translated a work, sold it to commercial press, received a lump sum of money, and then after that, he never cared about how many copies were sold, how much money, how much each copy cost. And so that's why he had this, as Michael Hill's study like shows that he has this factory of translators. They just like produce translation like crazy, and commercial press just purchase them. And whether or not commercial press publish them, and whether or not the commercial press make money is not Lin Shu's concern. And so eventually, after 1990, after May 4th movement, commercial press suffer the consequences of that. But Lin Shu, it did not affect in Lin Shu at all. And in terms of like technology and the making and unmaking of piracy, this is such a big question. Like my short answer is yes, of course, it's changed. The technology of like textual reproduction or content reproduction also enable or allow new forms of piracy, and those new forms of piracy sometimes inform or enrich the mainstream like content production to a certain extent. And so later, the last one, so the changing connotation of reprinting. Yes, I think this is a great observation. And we do see like different moral discourses would add on to like reprinting, and also the profit that got generated from reprinting. But what I would like to highlight or stress here is that there may be multiple moral discourses going on, like when it comes to like reprinting. And so if we consider this is an act that is the equivalent of stealing other people's property, other people's idea, and so then this is considered like as a crime, or as something like morally questionable. But at the same time, there is also this Robin Hood like idea going on here. And so like the later intellectuals and later on the communist publishers also at times employ this. There is, yes, we are stealing, but we are stealing for good. So there is another set of moral discourses that like we are doing this in order to make knowledge more accessible to the rest of the society. So this is a patriotic move. This is an enlightenment mission, and so for that reason, this is good and should not be punished. And so yes, there are a lot of moral discourses and judgments that got attached or add on to like the act of reprinting itself throughout the period I study. But there is more than one moral discourses that got employed. And so
Wonderful. Thanks. Upon that note, I think we are bringing this event to a closure. So I want to thank everybody for your participation and our discussants for their excellent question. And thank you, audience, for your great comments and questions. But finally, I think I'm going to turn the floor to the director of our Center for Chinese Studies, Professor Tim Cheek, to give some conclusive remarks here. And Tim, the floor is yours.
There you go. There you go. Now I'm on, I think. I want to thank you all for a wonderful session. I learned a lot, and I'll think twice before using my pirated copies that I got in Taiwan back in the 1970s. There we go. And I promise only to have a non-pirated version of your book. I'm sorry that I wasn't on to say the introduction. As you can see from my gray hair, I don't know how to work the internet, and I goofed up which login to use. So that went well. That didn't go so well. But I'm delighted and want to particularly thank Professor Yang Renren for bringing this really fine conversation to the Center for Chinese Research, and we look forward for more similar. And I want to echo Jia Qi's warm welcome. We hope that we can get you into the center where she's sitting right now. And thank you to all, and a good night.
Get your book. I got my own copy, and it's a hardboard one here. Okay. Okay, thank you, everyone. And good night, everybody.